She knocked, shivering and silent. Her lips were frozen. The note in her hand said only, "Warm me?"
Garen's soul wasn't expecting anyone. No one knocked in Sector 8C. The outer districts of the station grid were half abandoned, swallowed by frost and drifting snow for most of the standard year. Out here, people didn't come to visit. They came to disappear. Garen, 46, knew that better than most. He lived alone in a freight capsule once used for atmospheric supply storage, a reinforced prefab welded to the collapsed tram depot. After a career in insulation tech and emergency sealant maintenance, he'd taken a final job inspecting the atmospheric grid and then stopped showing up. No one came looking. He kept the local stabilizer running from inside his capsule, sent in the metrics, and never answered his comm. It was simpler that way. He stayed alive. He stayed out of trouble. He made his life small on purpose, which is why, when 2 knocks landed on the door during a whiteout, he stood frozen for several seconds. Not curious, not scared, just processing. He was standing at the edge of his utility space, working on a cracked heating conduit pulled from a depot tank. The inside of the capsule was dim. Light panels half-powered to conserve draw, warm orange glow from a salvaged floor lamp casting low shadows across a bench cluttered with stripped thermal cables, solder nodes, and a half-finished stew steaming under a coil warmer. The storm outside was full-blown. The monitor screen read -56, wind speed at 130 kilometers per hour, and rising. No one should have been out there. His first thought was maybe a sensor had dislodged, or a panel had broken loose and struck the hull. Then he heard it again. Knock, knock. 2 slow taps. Measured, not mechanical. He turned. He walked to the door, not fast, not slow. Deliberate. Fingers hovered over the pressure seal release for a few seconds while his mind flipped through everything he could remember about sector breach protocols. Nothing lined up. He pressed the switch. The inner seal hissed and retracted. Cold exploded inward. A howling gust of wind shoved against him like a wall, carrying snow and ash and the sting of metal fracturing air. And then through it, a figure, kneeling, just outside the frame. Garen's mind went blank for a moment. He stepped forward 1 pace and then froze again. It was a woman, not human. Her skin, what he could see of it, was a deep jade green, and her body was barely covered in what looked like a soaked, torn mesh garment. The fabric clung to her shape, transparent now from wet and wind, pressing to the slope of her thighs and hips. Her bare arms curled around herself as if she could hold in the last of her body heat. No shoes. Her feet were blue at the tips, ankles scraped and marked by what looked like old band impressions, possibly medical restraints. Her shoulders were exposed, knees bruised, hair long, pure white, soaked and tangled. Some of it stuck to her mouth. She was shaking, hard, but she hadn't collapsed. And in one hand, clenched like it was the only thing that kept her alive, was a torn sheet of packaging fiber. Garen squinted. The wind almost tore it from her grip. 3 words, handwritten in black smudge ink. "Warm me?" Garen stared at her. Everything about her screamed, "Don't get involved." He didn't know what race she was. Not Valari, not Chiron, not one of the easier to classify refugees. He didn't know if she was dangerous. He didn't know if someone was watching. But her eyes lifted and met his. Teal, glowing faintly in the cold, her expression blank. Not hopeful, not begging, just waiting. His fingers clenched on the door handle. If he let her in, that was it. No excuses. He would have to lie on his grid usage. He would have to reroute food rations. He would have to cut heat to the outer vents or risk system pings. If she died inside, he'd be questioned. If she stayed alive, he'd be hiding her. But he stepped aside. "Get in," he said. She didn't respond. Her body tilted forward and then collapsed into him as her legs buckled. Garen caught her, the impact more jarring than he expected. Her skin was ice cold. Not just cold, dangerous. Her weight sank into him, her cheek brushing his collarbone, and for the first time in years, he realized his hands were shaking. She was real, flesh and bone and freezing, and he had no idea who she was. He pulled her fully inside, turned, and slammed the door. The pressure seal hissed shut again, locking the cold outside. The silence returned. She crumpled at his feet, still trembling, not moving, the soaked mesh clinging to her body as a puddle spread beneath her on the floor. Garen moved fast now. He grabbed a thermal blanket off the utility rack, vac-sealed and used, and tore it open, wrapping it around her torso. Then he crouched beside her, leaned her carefully back against the wall panel. "Can you hear me?" he asked. "Can you blink?" Her eyelids fluttered. Twice. Then again. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay." She hadn't passed out. That was something. He stood, crossed to the sink, and activated the warm line. It sputtered. He hadn't used it in 3 days, but eventually, thin, steaming water trickled out. He soaked a towel, folded it, and returned. "Knelt. I'm going to touch your face now," he said. No response, but she didn't flinch. He dabbed the wet towel gently along her cheeks, down the side of her jaw. The heat made her twitch. She let out a small, rasping breath that caught in her chest. He moved the towel along her arm, wiping slowly, checking her fingers. Her nails were cracked, skin raw. She had bruises on her inner forearms. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. The air inside the capsule grew thicker with warmth. The heater core had kicked into override mode. That was going to spike his usage. He'd have to adjust for it. Delay uploads. Lower lighting. He looked down at her. Her eyes were open, watching him. No fear. No words. Only silence. Heavy. Intense. She was still shaking, but she hadn't taken her eyes off him since he'd touched her. He sat beside her on the floor, breath slow. One hand rested on the blanket over her lap, and the other stayed ready in case she collapsed again. He could feel the sweat starting to build under his coat. The note. He reached down and gently pulled it from her hand. It was crumpled, damp now, but still readable. "Warmy?" He folded it carefully, put it in his pocket. Not trash. Not yet. Then he leaned his head back against the wall and let his breath out through his nose. Whoever she was, whatever her story, he couldn't undo what he'd done now. He'd let her in. Now, she was his problem. The cabin stayed quiet for a long time. Garen didn't move. He sat with his back against the wall, arms crossed, watching the alien woman's breathing gradually deepen. Her skin, now drying in patches beneath the blanket, had gone from waxen to flushed olive around the collar and shoulders. She was warming up, but not enough. She still hadn't spoken. He wasn't even sure she could. The thought circled back like a weight in his chest. Why hadn't she said anything? Even one word? If she had the strength to knock, the clarity to write something, why not speak? He ran a hand across his jaw, fingers brushing rough stubble. There were possibilities, trauma, damage to her vocal cords, even cultural difference. Some species communicated without verbal language. He'd worked with a few during his time in the insulation corps. But this one, whoever she was, she watched him with a level of awareness that told him it wasn't confusion. She understood. She was choosing silence. The heater let out a soft hum as the cabin's internal temperature reached equilibrium. Condensation had begun to form on the metal seams around the door, and Garen knew that by morning, his power usage would be flagged for audit. He'd have to run a bypass to delay the log entry. He stood and moved quietly to the far end of the capsule, little more than 4 strides, and pulled a canister from a food rack. Emergency rehydrated stew, synthetic base, high calorie. He slid it into the warmer coil and tapped the input. As it hissed to life, he glanced over his shoulder. She hadn't taken her eyes off him, still silent, still wrapped in the blanket. But her legs had drawn in now, knees up, arms folded around them beneath the layers. The towel he'd used to clean her face had been tugged into her lap. Her eyes flicked once toward the coil's orange glow, then back to him, noticing details, processing, watching how he moved, how he didn't reach for a weapon, didn't shout, didn't demand anything. Trust was growing, but carefully. The stew beeped. He pulled it out and moved to sit in front of her again, kneeling. He peeled the lid and set the small metal bowl between them. Her head tilted, nostrils flaring faintly at the steam rising up. Her lips were less blue now, dry, cracked, but no longer frostbitten. Garen held up a spoon, then slowly dipped it into the stew and offered it. She didn't flinch, but she didn't open her mouth either. He waited. Then, slowly, She leaned forward, closed her lips around the spoon, and pulled back. Swallowed. It was the first real movement she'd made by choice. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just dipped another spoonful, held it again. This time she accepted faster. By the sixth bite, she reached out herself. Her fingers brushed his, soft and still cool to the touch, and took the spoon. She fed herself the rest in silence. Garen sat back, exhaled through his nose, and finally spoke. "You're not registered," he said quietly. "You wouldn't be out there if you were." She didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the empty bowl. "If you were flagged, this capsule might already be on a scan list," he continued, tone low, conversational. "But if you're untagged, then we've got a small window before the system notices the heat spike. Food draw, moisture levels." Her hands gripped the bowl tighter. "You understand me," he said. A pause. Then finally she nodded. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was clear. He ran a hand across his face. "All right, that helps." He stood, moving to the panel near the water dispenser. Pulled up the auxiliary grid. His fingers flew across the touch keys, rerouting the heater's draw through his backup stabilizer cache. Not ideal. He'd need that power if things got worse this winter, but for now, it would mask the spike. Bought them time. When he turned around again, she was standing. She had wrapped the blanket around herself more tightly now, clutching it under her arms like a cloak. She was barefoot, standing on the insulated mat, watching him. Her posture was better, straighter, less like someone barely alive, more like someone measuring her space. She took 2 steps toward the wall mirror just beside the galley, looked at herself. Her reflection was harsh. Wet white hair tangled and streaked with grime, jaw slightly swollen, lips split. Her thighs were still marked from restraints, and her feet were cracked, skin peeling. She stared at herself like it wasn't her at all. Then, slowly, she looked at Garen in the mirror. He didn't say anything, just nodded to the bunk against the far wall. "Sleep if you want," he said. "It's clean. I'll take the floor." She turned to look at him directly, then took a hesitant step, and another. At the edge of the bunk, she paused, as if unsure if it was a test. Garen turned his back. He moved to the bench, adjusted the coil warmer's arm to point toward the wall instead, and sat down on the floor, back to her, arms resting on his knees. He heard the blanket shift behind him, cloth brushing mattress, the soft rustle of skin against fabric. No words, just quiet. And then, finally, the sound of a breath exhaled. Steady, softer than before. She was lying down. He stayed on the floor, staring at the silent heater coil. His mind reeled, despite how calm he tried to stay. Who was she? What was she running from? How the hell had she made it this far in nothing but mesh and instinct? And why? Why had she come to his door? He didn't believe in fate. Never had. But that note, warm me? It hadn't felt random. He sat there for a long time, until his legs ached and his back stiffened. Then he slowly laid down, turned the light to low amber, and closed his eyes. She was here now. That was the only fact that mattered. Everything else could wait. Tomorrow, they would have to figure out what came next. But tonight, she was alive, and he had let her in. When Garen woke, the heater coil was still humming low in the corner, and the cabin's internal temp held steady just above habitable. The air was dry and warm, tinged with the faint scent of synthetic stew and warm dust. He blinked against the amber ceiling light, now running on dim cycle, and slowly sat up on the floor, rubbing at the ache in his neck. The bunk was empty. He turned his head quickly, more sharply than he intended, but calmed as his eyes adjusted. She was there, standing, not beside the door, not near the exit, by the water unit, wrapped in his thermal coat now, the oversized black field jacket nearly swallowing her small frame. She'd bound the sleeves up to her elbows and left it open enough to show a sliver of her collar and part of her upper chest. Beneath, she still wore the black synth mesh slip, now dried and cleaner than before. She must have rinsed it during the night. Her hair had been brushed, poorly, but enough to smooth it, and she was staring at the sink unit as if trying to understand how it worked. Garen rose, slow, careful not to startle her. "It sticks sometimes," he said. "Takes pressure and patience." She didn't flinch, just stepped aside slightly, making room for him. He approached, twisted the pressure valve manually, and smacked the unit on the side. After a second, warm water began to trickle. She dipped her hand under it, not to drink, just to feel it. Her fingers flexed, then rested in the stream. Her skin glistened faintly, the green tone shifting ever so slightly under the heat. She's not mute, Garen thought. She's just choosing silence. Every action is careful, intentional. She turned her face slightly toward him, as if waiting for a sign. "You hungry?" he asked. A pause. Then another nod. He moved to the food locker, popped a ration seal, and started the warmer coil again. Behind him, she remained at the sink, now carefully using a cloth to clean her arms, neck, and collar. It struck him how deliberate she was, like every movement served a purpose. There was no panic, no outburst, but also no relief. Not yet. And that's when a question finally anchored in his mind. How had she made it through the outer zone alive? Not just through the cold, but through the surveillance drones, the food checkpoints, the outer sensors. The systems weren't aggressive, but they were thorough. Anything that drew heat, consumed rations, activated panels, it all created data. And data got flagged. She would have had to avoid everything. Or someone had helped her. He said nothing for now. She sat when he gestured, taking the same place on the floor mat as the night before. No hesitation this time. He handed her the heated meal container, simple protein grain, and let her eat without comment. As she ate, he sat nearby and tapped into the diagnostics panel. The screen pulsed once, then flashed yellow. Usage discrepancy. Air filtration cycle exceeded forecast. Possible external source. Review advised. He muted the alert and rerouted the log queue to delay audit upload by 48 hours. Not a solution, just time. He felt her watching him. She had finished eating and now sat quietly, legs crossed under the coat, her eyes scanning the tools on the wall. The sensor grid, the heating coils. She wasn't just resting, she was memorizing the layout. He broke the silence. "My name is Garen," he said. Garen Soul. A long pause. Her eyes didn't leave his. Then, she raised a hand and pressed her palm lightly to her chest. Then touched her fingers gently to her forehead. Then held them out, palm open, fingers slightly spread. He didn't understand, but something about it felt like a name or a greeting. Still no sound. Still no words. He nodded. "All right, we'll get there." She reached into the pocket of the thermal coat and pulled something out. A small metal tab, almost coin-sized. She held it out. He took it slowly. It was smooth, worn. On one side, a serial marking. Faint and partially erased. He frowned. "This is an ID tag," he said aloud. She nodded. "Yours." Another nod. He flipped it over again. The back had been melted deliberately, tampered to disable its tracking function. Someone had disabled the chip, likely with heat, probably by her own hand. This wasn't a random refugee. She had escaped something structured, something systemic, and she knew enough to try and erase her data signature. He set the tag down gently between them. "You're undocumented now," he said. "They'll be looking for this. But maybe not you, if you're lucky." No reaction, but something in her jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly. "Did you escape from the deportation zone?" No nod this time. Instead, her eyes slowly lowered. Her body stilled. Her breath caught, just for a second. And Garen understood. That was a yes, but not one she wanted to admit out loud, even silently. He didn't press further. Instead, he reached out, took the tag, and slipped it into the base of his stabilizer unit's outer panel. "Hidden. Buried. You don't have to explain anything," he said. "Not here." She looked up again. And, for the first time, something changed in her eyes. Not just attention. Recognition. He saw it. The shift. A faint softness around the mouth. A small tilt of the head. A breath drawn. Not in fear or exhaustion, but in awareness. She was seeing him now, as someone real. Not just shelter. Not just heat. A man. And for the first time since she arrived, she moved toward him. Not much, but enough to close the distance between them by one full step. And then she sat beside him. He didn't speak. They sat together side by side on the floor, the heater coil glowing faintly in the corner, the storm outside still whispering through the metal walls. They didn't need words. Not yet, but the silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like trust beginning to take shape. The next night, the capsule was warmer than it had ever been. Too warm, actually. Garen had manually bypassed the heater's safety limiters to suppress logging intervals, which let the unit run hotter without triggering alerts. But it came at a cost. The backup cell was draining faster than he liked, and if anyone in the district requested a shared audit, the spike would be obvious. He sat on the floor in his sweat-damp undershirt, back to the wall, an old multi-tool in one hand, stripped thermal wire in the other. His jacket was draped across the utility hook, drying from earlier. Across from him, on the floor mat where she'd begun to settle each evening, Ilari sat with her legs folded neatly under her, watching the micro heater. Still no words. 3 days now, and she hadn't said a single thing. But the silence had changed. She responded to his voice with glances. Her eyes shifted gently to follow his hands when he moved. And earlier, when he passed her a warm cloth to dry her arms after a makeshift rinse, her fingers had brushed his, not by accident. Not clumsy, just long enough to leave heat between their skin. She was cleaner now, her hair fully dry, combed with the edge of his solder brush, loosely tied behind her back with an old fabric strap. She wore his backup shirt, oversized, buttoned halfway down her chest, sleeves rolled high. She still moved carefully, almost silently, like she wasn't sure if the space was truly hers. But she didn't flinch anymore. Garen caught himself looking at her too long, then looked away. He hadn't shared a space like this with anyone in years. He wasn't sure he even remembered how to. The capsule had always been a quiet retreat, functional, isolated, dependable. Now, it smelled faintly of her skin after each rinse. And every time he moved around her, he noticed the softness of her breath, the warmth she left in the bedding, and the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't noticing. That morning, after waking on the floor again, he'd stood to stretch and realized she was watching him. Closely, her eyes had lowered down his chest, paused for a breath, then returned to his face. She hadn't looked away when he met her gaze. She was beginning to choose presence, not just survival. That changed everything. Now, he couldn't shake the feeling she was waiting for something. Not words, not questions, permission. He lowered the coil he'd been working with and set it aside, then looked at her. "You're safe here," he said. She didn't move. "I know you're afraid the system will catch up," he continued. "The heat draw, the water use, the food logs, everything in this place reports back. Even now, even low band." She looked at the stabilizer panel behind him, just briefly. She understood. "I've delayed the uploads," he said. 2 more days before they get flagged. I'll have to cycle the relay after that. Maybe redirect power to the vents. Make it look like a leak." No reaction. "You're still free to go," he added quietly. "If you want to. You're not locked in. I won't stop you." She looked at him fully now. Face calm. No alarm. Then she did something new. She stood. The movement was slow, steady, barefoot on the rubber floor. She walked over to him, not around, not at a distance, and sat down beside him, closer than before. Her shoulder touched his arm, and then she reached out. Her hand brushed the side of his face, fingers resting just below his jaw. Her palm was warm now. He could feel it, real heat, real circulation. Her skin had a faint shimmer when it caught the light. Garen didn't move. He just breathed. She touched his face with both hands now, slow and deliberate, then leaned forward. Not quickly, not with demand, but with certainty. Her forehead pressed gently to his. It wasn't a kiss. It was contact, sensory, a way to speak without sound. He let his eyes close. Her breath mixed with his. Her hands slid from his jaw to his collarbone, resting lightly, not asking for more. Her weight pressed slightly into his chest, and his arms, slow and uncertain, came around her. Not to hold, just to return the contact. Minutes passed. The capsule was silent, except for the hum of the heater and the soft friction of cloth between their bodies. Then she pulled back, only slightly, her eyes open now, teal bright, no longer cautious, and still silent. But it was clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. That night, She climbed into the bunk while he still sat by the wall. She didn't speak, just lifted the blanket and looked at him once, steady, quiet, an invitation. He didn't hesitate. When he lay beside her, their bodies barely touched, the warmth between them real and slow. Her hand found his under the blanket. No gesture, just a grip, firm, human. She shifted against him once, head resting on his shoulder. Her hair spread behind her, faintly cool at the tips. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she closed her eyes and slept deeply. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen to. The capsule changed. Not all at once, not visibly from the outside, but inside the shift was undeniable. Garen noticed it first in the way his routines broke without resistance. He used to wake early, plug in the diagnostic pad, run energy consumption forecasts, prep the stabilizer grid, and run coil checks before reheating the last of his rations. Now he woke up slowly. His first thought wasn't system calibration. It was whether she was still asleep beside him. And she usually was. Curled on her side, one hand beneath the shared blanket, her other lightly draped across his chest. Her breathing steady, her hair fanned across the pillow, brushing his jaw sometimes. She didn't speak, but in the mornings, she no longer avoided his gaze. Her eyes opened, found his, and stayed there. There was no need for a greeting. The warmth between them said enough. She had cleaned the capsule's floor one day while he was outside, collecting a relay shard from a collapsed terminal post. When he returned, the mat had been scrubbed. The side rack, once cluttered with old field gear, had been cleared and rearranged. One of his spare shirts was folded at the edge of the bunk. She was sitting cross-legged beside the heater, brushing her hair with a fork she'd repurposed from the utility drawer. She looked up as he stepped inside, met his eyes, then continued brushing. Garen hadn't said anything. He didn't have to. She had claimed the space. Quietly. Intentionally. That evening, she leaned her head against his shoulder while he read the audit logs. No tension, just soft contact. It felt like routine, but it wasn't ordinary. He knew what this was becoming, knew what it looked like, knew what it meant. She hadn't run. She hadn't vanished in the night. She was here. She had chosen this. Chosen him. But outside, the system hadn't forgotten them. The first ping came in the form of a delayed sync warning. His capsule's stabilizer grid, normally allowed 48-hour sync delay before alerts, was now on a 24-hour clock. The log hadn't been updated, but the countdown had changed. Faster. He rerouted diagnostics through his old work account credentials. It gave him 36 hours. Barely. The next day, the water draw monitor reported an anomalous spike. A glitch on paper. But Garen had been in the field long enough to know how these things stacked. One error didn't get you flagged. Two did. By nightfall, he disconnected the heater entirely from the main cycle, rerouting it through an ancient decommissioned battery core pulled from Survey Crawler. It would mask heat consumption for maybe a day. After that, he stared at the blinking lights on the battery's converter while Ilari sat across the room, folding one of his shirts with smooth, precise hands. She wasn't stupid. She had noticed his silence, the shift in his breathing, the way he watched the monitor more than her now. She crossed the room slowly, wearing just that same oversized shirt and nothing else beneath. Her skin was clean now, no more marks, no more grime. Her thighs bare and smooth, her eyes soft. She knelt beside him, pressed her forehead to his temple, and then, for the first time, she pressed her lips to his cheek. Not with heat, not with urgency, just connection. He turned, met her eyes, and said, "We don't have long." She didn't react the way he feared. No panic, no retreat. Instead, she took his hand and guided it slowly to her abdomen. At first, he didn't understand. Then he did. She looked at him, firmly now, eyes steady, lips parted, breath warm. She wasn't asking permission. She was telling him she was already staying. He felt the weight of her hand over his, pressed to her stomach. He knew what it meant. He wasn't a fool. He knew biology varied across species, but some things didn't need translation. The way her body had changed in small ways. The timing, the closeness, the silence with meaning behind it. She was carrying a part of him, and the system, if it found out, would never allow it. Not here, not in this district. not with her undocumented. He swallowed, let his forehead rest against hers, then whispered, "We'll disappear." Her fingers curled around the back of his neck. They both knew what came next. This wasn't about escape, not the way others imagined it. There were no tunnels, no chases, no fights. Just a decision to leave quietly, to vanish into the cracks of the world before it could notice them. And tonight would be the last night they spent in the capsule. Together, warm, undisturbed. The final night arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no patrols, no message alerts. Just the subtle tension of systems syncing too smoothly, power draw meters updating too precisely, and Garen's gut telling him the delay cycle had ended. The capsule had stopped being invisible. Every degree of heat, every ration dispensed, every extra water flush, they were no longer shadows in the system. He had pushed it to the edge. Now, if they had to go, the freight capsule had no traditional escape hatch, but it wasn't designed to hold people either. It was a retrofitted cargo container originally bolted to a stabilization pylon before the dome's shift buried half the sector in ice. Garen had known that when he picked it, that it wasn't traceable, that could vanish. That was why he'd chosen it. That was why he could leave it behind. He had spent the daylight hours gathering what little could be carried. A compact thermal battery, enough nutrient paste for a week, one functioning compass with a local grid overlay, and a reactor vest with power insulation stitched into the lining. He'd wrapped the items into a scavenged miner's satchel and locked it beside the outer access hatch. He burned the rest. Not in a fire, too risky. He dismantled every heat sink, every grid router, every identifiable frequency encoder, and fed them into the recycler one piece at a time. The stabilizer's CPU, once the brain of the entire station grid, was smashed under his boots, then folded into a heat coil and dumped into the coolant tray. It took hours. She watched him the whole time. Quiet, alert, her body wrapped in his second shirt and nothing else, sleeves rolled up, hem just barely covering her hips. Her legs bare, her skin warmer now, more radiant under the low light. She sat cross-legged on the floor mat where she'd first collapsed days ago. Only now, she wasn't trembling. She was waiting. She had packed nothing, asked nothing. She trusted him. Garen knelt in front of her when it was done. "We leave at low cycle," he said. 2 hours from now. By foot. We'll skirt the shield dome and head east. There's an abandoned thermal farm 7 kilometers out. No power, no logs. It's off the net. We can hole up there for a few days. Maybe longer." She nodded. Slow, calm. Her hand slid to her belly. Held it. He looked down at her fingers, then up at her eyes. "You sure?" he asked. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his chest. Her arms wrapped around him. That was her answer. He pulled her close. No hesitation this time. No silence between them. Just warmth. Human and not, but undeniable. Her skin against his was hot now, flush from the rising cabin temperature, from him, from everything they'd been holding back. She didn't pull back. When her lips finally touched his, it was slow, real. Her body climbed into his lap as the heater pulsed behind them. Her breath against his neck was shallow, warm. Her hands moved over his chest, his arms, his face, exploring him like a map she had memorized but now needed to feel again. He let her. Their bodies pressed together without rush, without urgency. Just heat. Slow. Skin against skin. The shirt slipped from her shoulders, draped across his thighs. Her thighs parted around him. He kissed her neck, her collar, her mouth. Nothing frantic, nothing claimed, just shared. Every movement between them was silent, like the rest of their language. He held her for what felt like hours, wrapped in blankets, her hand resting again over her abdomen, fingers brushing his. When she looked at him, still without a word, there was nothing unsure in her gaze. He saw in her expression what he needed to see before they left. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. By the time the low-cycle chime echoed from the old system clock, they were already dressed. The capsule was empty, erased. The only thing left was the note she had arrived with, folded carefully in his coat pocket. "Warm me." He paused at the hatch. She stood beside him, boots now covering her feet. His old pair, too large, stuffed with thermal cloth. Her white hair was tied back, her neck bare, her posture straight. She held his hand. He opened the door. The cold hit like a blade. But she didn't flinch. They stepped out together. Into the snow, into the wind, into whatever came next. He didn't look back, and neither did she. The final night arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no patrols, no message alerts, just the subtle tension of systems syncing too smoothly, power draw meters updating too precisely, and Garen's gut telling him the delay cycle had ended. The capsule had stopped being invisible. Every degree of heat, every ration dispensed, every extra water flush, there were no longer shadows in the system. He had pushed it to the edge. Now, they had to go. The freight capsule had no traditional escape hatch, but it wasn't designed to hold people either. It was a retrofitted cargo container originally bolted to a stabilization pylon before the dome's shift buried half the sector in ice. Garen had known that when he picked it, that it wasn't traceable, that it could vanish. That was why he'd chosen it. That was why he could leave it behind. He had spent the daylight hours gathering what little could be carried. A compact thermal battery, enough nutrient paste for a week, one functioning compass with a local grid overlay, and a reactor vest with power insulation stitched into the lining. He'd wrapped the items into a scavenged miner's satchel and locked it beside the outer access hatch. He burned a rest. Not in a fire, too risky. He dismantled every heat sink, every grid router, every identifiable frequency encoder, and fed them into the recycler one piece at a time. The stabilizer CPU, once the brain of the entire station grid, was smashed under his boots, then folded into a heat coil and dumped into the coolant tray. It took hours. She watched him the whole time. Quiet, alert, her body wrapped in a second shirt and nothing else, sleeves rolled up, hem just barely covering her hips. Her legs bare, her skin warmer now, more radiant under the low light. She sat cross-legged on the floor mat where she'd first collapsed days ago. Only now, she wasn't trembling. She was waiting. She had packed nothing, asked nothing. She trusted him. Garen knelt in front of her when it was done. "We leave at low cycle," he said. 2 hours from now. By foot. We'll skirt the shield dome and head east. There's an abandoned thermal farm 7 kilometers out. No power, no logs. It's off the net. We can hole up there for a few days. Maybe longer." She nodded. Slow. Calm. Her hand slid to her belly. Held it. He looked down at her fingers. Then up at her eyes. "You sure?" he asked. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his chest. Her arms wrapped around him. That was her answer. He pulled her close. No hesitation this time. No silence between them. Just warmth. Human and not, but undeniable. Her skin against his was hot now, flush from the rising cabin temperature, from him, from everything they'd been holding back. She didn't pull back. When her lips finally touched his, it was slow, real. Her body climbed into his lap as the heater pulsed behind them. Her breath against his neck was shallow, warm. Her hands moved over his chest, his arms, his face, exploring him like a map she had memorized but now needed to feel again. He let her. Their bodies pressed together without rush, without urgency. Just heat. Slow. Skin against skin. The shirt slipped from her shoulders, draped across his thighs. Her thighs parted around him. He kissed her neck, her collar, her mouth. Nothing frantic, nothing claimed, just shared. Every movement between them was silent, like the rest of their language. He held her for what felt like hours, wrapped in blankets, her hand resting again over her abdomen, fingers brushing his. When she looked at him, still without a word, there was nothing unsure in her gaze. He saw in her expression what he needed to see before they left. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. By the time the low cycle chime echoed from the old system clock, they were already dressed. The capsule was empty, erased. The only thing left was the note she had arrived with, folded carefully in his coat pocket. "Warm me." He paused at the hatch. She stood beside him, boots now covering her feet. His old pair, too large, stuffed with thermal cloth. Her white hair was tied back, her neck bare, her posture straight. She held his hand. He opened the door. The cold hit like a blade. But she didn't flinch. They stepped out together. into the snow, into the wind, into whatever came next. He didn't look back, and neither did she. The walk to the thermal farm took most of the night. The wind didn't ease, but the storm didn't come back either. It was just cold, bitter, dry, biting cold that sliced through seams and made every exhale sting. But they didn't stop. Garen led with the compass tethered to his wrist, glancing down every 20 meters. Ilari stayed just behind him, one hand holding the strap of his pack, the other clutching his jacket tight across her chest. Her steps were careful, deliberate, but strong. He kept looking back to check on her. She never asked for help. When they finally crested the last ridge, a long, frozen slope above the canyon floor, the broken silhouette of the thermal station came into view. 4 rusting towers half sunk into the snow, a collapsed control room, and 1 intact generator chamber built into the earth. They approached without words. By the time Garen overrode the manual door seal and got them inside, their hands were numb, legs trembling. But the space was dry and still. The generator chamber smelled like metal and oil. Its walls were thick, built to contain radiation back when it used to matter. Now it was quiet, abandoned, safe. He set the pack down, started rigging the thermal cell into the wall socket. She watched from the middle of the room, shivering, her skin flushed from wind. Her hair had come loose, white strands clinging to her lips. When the cell powered on, the lights flickered. Then, soft amber glow. Warmth. Ilari stepped forward slowly, her boots leaving melted prints across the floor. She stopped in front of him. Her hands reached for his coat, undid the zip, and slid inside it, wrapping her arms around his waist. He held her tightly. They didn't speak. They never needed to. By morning, the station was livable. The temperature held, the cell was stable, and the backup sensors showed 0 outbound signals. They had done it. The day passed slow. He cooked what little they had. She rested, curled beneath 2 old thermal blankets on a foam mattress pulled from the wall rack. He sat beside her most of the time, one hand resting on her hip under the covers, steady, real. That night, while she slept, he checked the diagnostics one last time. There was 1 log, minor relay trace, non-priority. It meant a drone had swept the area sometime in the last cycle. Not searching, just logging presence. But it had registered no ID, no heat draw outside spec, no life signs beyond what an old machine core might emit. It had seen nothing. Garen stared at the log, then deleted it. That was it. That was the last moment anything from the outside touched them. Weeks passed, then months. The wind outside never stopped, but inside the chamber, time settled. Garen reinforced the walls, re-insulated the hatch, and rerouted solar trickle panels into their cell housing. Ilari cleaned, cooked what she could, rearranged what little space they had into something warm, something personal. She began humming sometimes. Soft sounds, short rhythms. He'd wake to them. And then, one night, she took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. She was showing now, slightly, enough that he could feel the change. Her skin warmer in that spot, her breathing softer when he touched her. She didn't look away. She let him feel everything. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, then her stomach. When they lay together again that night, it was without fear. Her legs tangled with his, her fingers pressed to his chest. No tension, no hiding. They were home. And when the next sunrise came, muted, filtered through the old glass pane overhead, she stood by the wall, braided her long white hair over one shoulder, and looked down at the man sleeping in her bed. The man who had opened his door and given her more than warmth. He'd given her a life, and she wasn't letting it go.